The accusation came dressed as certainty long before anyone found proof. That was what hurt most. Not the missing watch itself. Not even the fact that half the dining room stopped talking when the manager said her name out loud. It was the speed with which everyone in the room seemed willing to believe that if something valuable had disappeared, the black woman carrying plates must somehow be connected to it. "Danielle, stay right there," the restaurant manager said, voice clipped in public, just loud enough to turn curiosity into theater. Leaned back to watch, and Danielle Brooks leaned back to watch. And Danielle Brooks, still balancing a tray with two unfinished dessert plates, felt the whole room shift around her in that familiar, terrible way. Not toward the truth, but toward the easiest story. Less than 5 minutes later, when the woman finally opened her own purse and found the watch tucked beside her lipstick case, the same room that had been so ready to suspect Danielle would suddenly become fascinated by napkins, water glasses, and anywhere else it could place its shame. But in that moment, standing beneath the soft golden lights of one of the city's most expensive dining rooms, all Danielle knew was that a white manager had chosen her as the most convenient answer before asking anyone else a single useful question. The restaurant was called Marrow House, and it sat on the edge of downtown Charlotte in a converted brick warehouse that rich people described as industrial elegance because they liked exposed beams as long as someone else polished them. There were candles on every table, heavy linen napkins, curated jazz, and the kind of menu that made root vegetables sound aristocratic. The guests came for celebration dinners, business closings, anniversaries, and the thrill of paying too much for food they would later describe as an experience. The staff came because upscale restaurants tip well when the customers are in a good mood and the managers don't make the work unbearable. Danielle Brooks had been at Marrow House for 11 months, long enough to know where all the trouble lived. It lived in table 13 when hedge fund men ordered bourbon and wanted flirtation with their steak. It lived in private dining when bridal parties treated servers like scenery. It lived in Sunday brunch when church people tipped with folded smiles and pocket change. And it lived most unpredictably in the front-of-house manager, Melissa Crane. Melissa was white, 43, polished in the way women who weaponize composure often are, with sleek blonde hair, sharp black blazers, and the permanent expression of someone forced to tolerate less competent people for the sake of standards. She liked order, she liked control, and she liked Danielle least of all, though she would never have said it plainly. Instead, she said things like, "You need to be warmer," when Danielle was perfectly professional but not submissive enough to be mistaken for cheerful obedience. She said, "Try not to sound defensive," whenever Danielle corrected a mistaken table number or clarified an order Melissa herself had misinterpreted. And she had once, in the service alley by the kitchen, told another manager that Danielle had a chip-on-the-shoulder energy that some guests pick up, which was wealthy white restaurant code for black woman who does not smile on command. Danielle was 29, a single mother to a 6-year-old boy named Isaiah, and one of the best servers in the building by every metric that actually mattered. She remembered allergies. She timed wine service properly. She could manage 4 high-maintenance tables without dropping her tone or her tray. She also had the kind of memory that made her invaluable in restaurants and dangerous in unfair ones. She remembered which guests claimed they never got an appetizer they had eaten, which supervisors disappeared when a table turned racist. That Saturday night had been heavy from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. She kept most of that to herself because rent was due regardless of dignity. But she remembered. That Saturday night had been heavy from the start. Full book, 2 six-tops late, 1 chef in a bad mood, a broken espresso machine, Melissa prowling the floor like every inconvenience personally insulted her. Danielle was working the center section, including table 12, where the guests were celebrating what the reservation notes described as milestone birthday/high expectations. High expectations usually meant one of two things: generous gratitude or expensive misery. This party leaned hard toward the second. The woman whose watch would later cause the scene was named Cynthia Vale. White, maybe late 50s, diamonds in both ears, expensive cream dress, the kind of face that had been taught by money to expect the room to adjust around it. She had arrived with her husband, another couple, and a younger woman Danielle assumed was their daughter or daughter-in-law. From the beginning, Cynthia had the restless, dissatisfied energy of someone who needed a flaw in the evening so she could feel important correcting it. The martini was too cold, then not cold enough. The bread came quickly but felt rushed. The salmon looked perfect but was a touch assertive. By dessert, Danielle had already endured 3 smiling micro-insults and 1 deliberate finger snap. Still, she remained steady. You do not survive restaurants by expecting gratitude. You survive them by managing timing and your own pulse. At 9:12, Danielle dropped the check folder at table 12 after clearing most of the dessert plates. Cynthia was laughing loudly at something her husband said and had taken off her watch, a slim gold Cartier with a diamond bezel, to show the younger woman how Richard had finally learned after 30 years what I actually like. Danielle saw the watch because anyone in service notices objects people want treated as precious. Cynthia set it briefly beside her clutch, admired it one more time, then picked up her champagne. Danielle moved on to greet table 14 and refill waters at 11. At 9:19, Melissa intercepted her near the bar. Did you just clear 12? Yes. Mrs. Vale says her watch is missing. Danielle frowned immediately. I didn't touch her watch. Melissa's eyes cooled. I didn't say you did. But the tone said she absolutely had. Danielle kept her voice level. It was on the table when I dropped the check. Melissa looked toward table 12, where Cynthia was now patting around the tablecloth with theatrical distress, while her husband looked annoyed enough for the whole section. Well, it's gone now. Danielle glanced at the bus tub in her hand. Then maybe it's in her purse or under the table. Melissa's lips thinned. Stay here. Danielle knew at once this was about to become ugly. Good managers protect staff until facts appear. Bad managers protect the restaurant's wealthiest-looking customer first and let the staff become collateral. Melissa chose the second route without hesitation. She crossed to table 12, bent down, listened for 20 seconds, then turned and called across the floor. Danielle, stay right there. Too loud. Far too loud. Conversations at 3 nearby tables softened instantly. A man at the bar looked over. The bartender froze mid-polish. Danielle stood still because movement would look guilty to people already choosing the wrong story. Melissa approached with Cynthia just behind her. Mrs. Vale's watch was here, Melissa said, pointing toward the table as though reconstructing a theft. You were the last person at this section before it went missing. There it was. Public, direct, and built entirely on timing instead of evidence. Danielle could feel eyes on her from every angle now. I was the server, she said. That doesn't mean I touched her things. Cynthia gave a short, offended laugh. Well, somebody did. Her husband added, This is a $10,000 watch. Danielle looked at Melissa. Are you seriously doing this out here? Melissa folded her hands in front of herself, the picture of managerial gravity. I'm trying to resolve it quickly. No, Danielle said, and the truth in her voice was sharp enough to make one nearby diner look down at his plate. You're trying to make me the answer before you have one. Melissa's face hardened. Watch your tone. That line almost made Danielle laugh. A black woman being calmly accused in public was expected to monitor tone, while the white people humiliating her were called concerned. I know exactly what tone I'm using, Danielle replied. Cynthia crossed her arms. Can someone check her apron? Silence slammed into the room. Not because anybody believed it was appropriate, because too many people were willing to let the moment continue as long as they were not the ones under it. Danielle's whole body went cold. Absolutely not. Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable to outsiders, while still making the threat clear. If there's nothing there, then there's nothing to worry about. Danielle stared at her. You want to search me on the floor in front of guests because a woman who's been drinking champagne can't find her own watch? Cynthia gasped as though the insult had somehow moved in the wrong direction. And then something important happened. Not justice, not yet. Witness. A server from the next section, Miguel, spoke from the service station with more courage than most people manage in these moments. She didn't take it, he said. I was in the aisle twice. Melissa turned on him instantly. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us if you start doing this without proof. That shifted the room in a new way. Still not enough to save Danielle, but enough to crack the performance. A woman at table 9 murmured something to her companion and looked openly uncomfortable. One of the bartenders stopped pretending not to hear. Even Cynthia's younger companion now looked uneasy, glancing from the table to the floor, to Cynthia's chair, with the expression of someone beginning to suspect they were all standing on the wrong side of something ugly. Melissa, however, had gone too far to retreat gracefully. "Danielle," she said, "I'm asking you one time to cooperate." Danielle set down the bus tub on an empty side station with deliberate care. "And I'm telling you one time that if you accuse me, you better be ready to prove it." Cynthia's husband muttered, "This is unbelievable." Danielle turned to him. "Yes," she said, "it is." That was when the younger woman at the table, late 20s, white, nervous energy, probably the daughter-in-law, spoke up for the first time. "Mom," she said quietly, "did you check your purse?" Cynthia swung toward her. "Of course I checked my purse." But the younger woman didn't look convinced. "You put your lipstick away when the desserts came. Maybe you slipped it in with—" "I know what I did," Cynthia snapped. Danielle felt something flicker in the room. A possible exit. Not because Cynthia deserved one, because truth was suddenly opening a door, and only pride was blocking it. Melissa, instead of taking that exit, doubled down again. "Mrs. Vale has already looked." The younger woman flushed. "I just think maybe before this goes any further." But Cynthia was already opening her clutch with sharp, angry motions, meant to prove everyone else foolish. "Fine," she said. "Happy now?" The room held still. She pulled out lipstick, compact mirror, car key fob, folded receipt. Then her fingers stopped. Her expression changed so quickly it was almost cruel. She reached deeper, and there it was, the gold watch, curled against the inner seam beside a velvet coin pocket, exactly where a slim bracelet-style watch might slide if dropped in carelessly while juggling a drink in a makeup case. Nobody moved. Cynthia stared at it like it had personally betrayed her. The daughter-in-law closed her eyes briefly. Miguel looked at the ceiling. Melissa went so still she seemed to disappear inside her blazer. Danielle did not speak because there are some vindications too complete for immediate language. Cynthia finally lifted the watch halfway out and said, with the world's weakest grip on dignity, "Oh, that single syllable might have been funny in another life. In this one, it was obscene. Because oh was all the room got after 5 minutes of racial suspicion, public humiliation, and a suggestion that a black server be searched on the floor." The husband looked at the tablecloth as if perhaps it could absorb the scene retroactively. Melissa recovered first, though badly. "Well," she said, forcing a brittle little smile, "I'm glad that's resolved." Danielle turned slowly and looked at her. Resolved. That was the word. Not apologized for. Not corrected. Resolved, as if the problem had been a misplaced accessory rather than a manager choosing the most vulnerable person in the room and offering her up as an explanation. "No," Danielle said. Her voice was quiet enough that everyone had to lean into it. "It's found. That's not the same thing." Melissa's face tightened. "Danielle." "No." Danielle was shaking now, not visibly to everyone, but enough that she felt it in her wrists. "You accused me in front of a full dining room. She asked to search my apron. You stood there and acted like that made sense. So no, Melissa, this isn't resolved." The room went silent again, but differently this time. Not hungry silence. Ashamed silence. Cynthia opened her mouth, perhaps to offer some thin version of regret. Danielle looked at her directly. "Do not say you're sorry just because you found it yourself. You were ready to believe it was me." The younger woman at the table whispered, "She's right." That mattered more than it should have. Not because Danielle needed a white witness to know what happened, but because people like Cynthia and Melissa so often rely on the room's willingness to pretend nothing ugly occurred if the accused person survives it. Tonight, the room had heard too much. At the far end of the dining room, the general manager, Anton DeLuca, emerged from the office corridor with the expression of a man who had been told there was a problem and expected broken stemware, not moral collapse. White, early 50s, carefully tailored, and usually more interested in reservation counts than staff dignity, Anton arrived just in time to read the scene backward from everyone's faces. "What happened?" Nobody answered immediately. That itself told him enough. Then Miguel, bless him, said exactly what had happened. Mrs. Vale thought her watch was stolen. Melissa blamed Danielle in front of the floor. Then it turned out it was in Mrs. Vale's purse. Anton's expression sharpened. He looked at Melissa. Is that accurate? Melissa tried the managerial version first. There was confusion, and I was attempting to de-escalate a guest concern. Danielle laughed once. Not kindly. Anton turned toward her. Danielle? She wanted to search my apron. Now the entire room changed again. Anton's jaw set. Whether from ethics or optics, Danielle did not much care in that moment. Melissa, he said, voice suddenly very controlled. Office. Now. Melissa went pale. Anton, I can explain. Office. Now. Then he turned to Cynthia Vale, who at last seemed to understand that money could not buy back a public moment once everyone had seen it naked. Mrs. Vale, he said, you will of course not be charged for dessert this evening, but my employee will be receiving a formal apology before you leave this building. Cynthia looked as if she would rather swallow the watch whole, still under the stare of half the room and the absolute absence of support from her own purse. She stood. She looked at Danielle and said, I misjudged the situation. Danielle said nothing. The woman tried again. I apologize. It was insufficient. It was late. It was still more than Melissa had offered. Danielle nodded once, not to forgive, but to end the performance. Cynthia sat back down, smaller somehow. Melissa disappeared into the office. In the dining room, in the awkward, self-conscious aftermath of exposed prejudice, began the strange process of pretending it had always known what side of the moment it should have been on. A man at table 9 asked Danielle softly if she was all right. A woman at the bar shook her head in disgust on Danielle's behalf. The bartender sent out a free ginger ale without asking, because service workers build their own languages for solidarity when management fails them. Danielle finished the shift. That, more than anything, was its own kind of victory. Not because she should have had to, because leaving in tears would have made the night legible to people like Melissa as one more emotional collapse instead of what it really was. A theft of dignity attempted in public and stopped only by the truth falling out of the wrong purse. At 11:48, after the last table closed and chairs began going upside down on linenless tops, Anton called Danielle into the office. Melissa was already there. Eyes red, mouth tight. Anton spoke first. I reviewed the floor statements. Melissa acted outside policy and outside basic judgment. Danielle folded her arms. If the watch had stayed missing? If the watch had stayed missing? That landed harder than any shouting could have. Anton had no answer ready, because that was the real wound inside the evening, not what happened after the truth appeared. What almost happened before it did. How quickly a black woman in an apron had become search-worthy in a luxury restaurant full of people who would later insist they were horrified by racism in the abstract. I know that, Anton said quietly. Danielle's eyes stayed on him. Do you? He nodded once, and for the first time she thought maybe he did. Melissa finally spoke, but her voice had lost all the crisp authority she used on the floor. I made a mistake. Danielle turned to her then. No, you made a choice. Melissa looked down. That was enough for Danielle. Not healing, not justice completed. Enough. She collected her bag, her son's school pickup schedule from her locker, and the cash tips from the night, still necessary, still insultingly ordinary, and walked out into the warm dark of the parking lot where her cousin was waiting to drive her home. When she told the story later, at her kitchen table with Isaiah asleep in the next room and her shoes finally off, she did not cry until she got to the part where the woman asked to search her apron. Would stop them. Danielle wiped under one would stop them. Danielle wiped under one eye and nodded. Yeah, but somebody did. Danielle thought of Miguel speaking up. The daughter-in-law saying, check your purse. The room shifting too late but still shifting. The watch emerging like proof against a lie that had nearly become real by momentum alone. Yeah, she said again. Somebody did. 2 weeks later, Marrow House rolled out a new floor protocol for guest accusations involving staff property claims. No employee could be confronted publicly. No search of personal effects without security and written incident report. Immediate section review before staff accusation. Anton announced it in pre-shift with the stiff tone of a man trying to make policy do the work character had previously failed to do. Melissa never came back. Danielle stayed. Not because the place deserved her loyalty, of power in remaining visible after people of power, in remaining visible after people had been forced to watch their assumptions collapse. Months later, a new hostess asked her why the old staff still called Table 12 the purse table. Danielle smiled without humor and said, because sometimes the truth is exactly where certain people should have looked first. And that was the whole story in the end. A restaurant manager blamed a black server for a missing watch because the room was ready for that answer. Because class and race make some suspicions feel natural to people who never interrogate themselves. Because public humiliation is still too often treated as acceptable collateral when the person under it is wearing an apron instead of pearls. Then the guest checked her own purse, and the lie collapsed under the weight of something as small and ordinary as being wrong in the right place.